Salutations! Chapter 5 is going to be a real treat because the learned professor is going to try and explain the nature of religion in evolutionary terms. Since evolution is the process by which our bodies and our natural instincts came into existence, and by which we developed our overt connection to the ideal, it is obvious that evolution, and biology more generally, plays a large role in how we conduct religious practices and express religious concepts. Unfortunately, Professor Dawkins is the last person I expect to be capable of illuminating this subject, considering his total lack of regard or respect for the dedicated study of religion and the paranormal, the proper understanding of which is essential to even begin unpacking the topic at hand. How could someone hope to form an informed opinion on the origin of a certain legend without knowing what the meaning of the legend is according to those who profess it? How could one possibly make a sound conclusion about the origin of a ritual without understanding what the participants of the ritual actually hope to accomplish and by what mechanism they believe it is supposed to work? The fact that Dawkins appealed to the golden bough earlier in this book and references it in this chapter shows that in this area he has no idea what he's talking about. The ideas found in that work are not only contradicted by the words of the actual religious traditions the author is describing, but have also been completely overturned and discarded by scholars from later times. Dawkins never mentions the works of any authors and researchers like Mircea Eliade, Rudolf Otto, Harry Oldmeadow, Jeremy Nadler, and Gregory Shaw, who cover the history, philosophy, psychology, and common elements of religion and traditional thought by studying the actual sources and practitioners as opposed to just making stuff up. Instead, he mentions other people in his own specific field who, so far as I can tell, are in no better position to speak on this topic than he is, but we will get to that later. Dawkins brushes over the placebo effect, dismissing the notion that religion developed as a vehicle for delivering placebos, especially to remove stress. He also dismisses the idea of group selection, which is when a socially enforced behaviour causes a social group to survive even when the genes of individual members are not favoured. According to Dawkins, individual behaviour will override group selection over time, as people who exploit the system by not engaging with the wasteful behaviours will reproduce more than those that do engage with them. On these conclusions, I trust the professor's insight as they directly pertain to his field of expertise. What the professor actually thinks is going on with religion is that it is a malfunction. An evolved trait that formerly helped our predecessors to survive is now being applied incorrectly, resulting in religious behaviours. Professor Dawkins proudly presents the humble moth as an example. The moth, whose whole cosmos is centered on the moon, becomes confused in the presence of a flame or lamp. Like Icarus, the moth draws too close to her celestial sphere and is destroyed. The professor thinks that this notion can be applied to human religion through children. Human children are very impressionable. They believe what their parents and elders tell them, and they persist in those beliefs until something comes along and breaks them. This is beneficial for survival because it means that children will obey survival advice their parents give them, but it doesn't separate good information from bad information. If these beliefs go unchallenged, they will be passed on to another generation of children and so on, aggregating into religions. In light of this hypothesis, we must come to the unfortunate conclusion that the learned professor has completely lost his mothballs. This supposed explanation does nothing at all to actually explain the pertinent evidence, and therefore completely fails as anything other than an imaginary fantasy. Under this obedience principle, an observer would expect to see random sets of unrelated and arbitrary beliefs coalescing in different cultural regions. As historians of religion have shown in immense detail, the sets of religious and paranormal ideas that develop in human cultures are as far from random and arbitrary as one could possibly imagine. The bare scientific facts are in total opposition to Dawkins's proposal. To be perfectly fair, Dawkins does qualify that he is not fully committed to this specific narrative, but rather to the hypothesis of malfunction in general. But there is also a serious underlying problem with the whole concept. In the example he uses, the moth's behaviour is a useful function that is disrupted by the sudden introduction of an external influence. It is a highly unusual circumstance for moths that only affects a small minority and has only become a problem in the past century. Religion is the opposite of unusual. It is the norm for all of the human populations on Earth and has been for as long as anyone can determine. Whatever it is that's causing religious behaviours, it's doing that more than it's doing anything else. If anything, the sudden rise of atheistic materialism in the past century is much more akin to the plight of the Moths, and much more likely to be our own evolutionary bug zapper. Now we're going to discover where Professor Dawkins got his information from, besides unsubstantiated and long debunked ramblings from the 19th century. What research did he do before penning this chapter? Dawkins cites 3 books, all from psychological experts. Admittedly, I didn't purchase and read through all of these books in preparation for writing this 3-page script, but I did look for summaries and reviews to ascertain the broad strokes of their contents. Robert Hind is an animal behaviour expert, and his book apparently references nothing about the history and philosophy of religion, instead dismissing any possible approach to the subject other than his own as worthless right at the start of the book. More importantly, Hind's book cites Professor Richard Dawkins as a major source, so Dawkins is effectively citing himself here. From what I can tell, it seems that Boyer doesn't address the important features of traditional modes of thought at all. Instead, he is primarily concerned with how people perceive personal agency or human-like qualities in phenomena that don't seem to objectively possess them, due to our brains being wired specifically to look for those things. This is a feature found in modern modes of thought as well, including secular, materialistic ones that have nothing to do with religion. Therefore, the information he brings to the table is basically irrelevant to the subject of religion and does absolutely nothing to explain it. I happen to already be familiar with Scott Atran, enough to know that his estimation of religion is the complete opposite of that of Professor Dawkins. While Atran himself is an atheist, he believes that religion is essential for maintaining social cohesion and as a source of value and virtue, and that without religious behaviour, civilization would be impossible. It is bizarre that Dawkins thinks it appropriate to invoke Atran in his assertion that religion is a dangerous malfunction, unless he is doing so under the assumption that nobody will bother to look up what he's saying, as he did before with Thomas Aquinas. Professor Dawkins presents us with a dichotomy between Cartesian dualism and materialistic monism, which he refers to simply as monism. It appears that the learned professor has never even heard of idealism, which is a kind of monism which is much older than materialism. Apparently, humans are natural-born dualists, drawing an instinctive distinction between the bases of abstract objects and that of concrete ones. We have a natural concept of the self and of other conscious agents that is independent of their physical vehicles, and this predisposes us to accepting the idea of an immaterial soul that can exist without a body. I would contest that we are in fact naturally idealists. The concept of extension in space filtered through our senses is something we get used to over time, as is attested by people who were born blind or deaf. When they have vision or hearing bestowed on them with medical assistance, they initially find the information entering their brains to be completely incomprehensible. They have to map the new information onto their existing awareness over time. Ibn Sina's floating man has a sense of identity and of abstract qualities, but no comprehension of the notion of spatial extension or matter. These physical experiences become ideas insofar as they are assimilated to them. Dawkins represents the soul as a sort of imp sitting inside the hollow shell of a body, pulling the strings. This is an absurd misrepresentation. The relationship between the brain and cognition has been understood since ancient times, having been discussed by Hippocrates and being generally evident to anyone who has ever observed the effects of a head injury. There are numerous examples of traditions maintaining that a body can operate without a personal soul, meaning all of the operations of the body, including the brain, are conceived of as existing in physical space, but of participating in form and in soul. In Professor Dawkins's mind, phenomena are either caused by physical forces or by non-physical forces which are identical to physical ones save for the fact that they are invisible. This thunderbolt was either caused by static electricity created by atmospheric friction discharging into the ground, or it was thrown by a bearded man in the sky. This mental state is either caused by electrochemical interactions in the brain, or by devils. Needless to say, this cartoonishly silly dichotomy would be completely alien to anyone living outside the post-18th century West. Let us use one of Plato's analogies, the analogy of the cave, to explain what is wrong with how Professor Dawkins perceives this entire discussion. Dawkins and his friends are chained up facing a cave wall, unable to see anything but the stone surface and the shadows that move across it. These shadows are cast by a puppet show being enacted behind them, illuminated by a fire. Dawkins sees one shadowy figure killing another. If we were to inform him that the second shadow was dead because of the actions of a puppet, he would respond, "Do you mean to tell me that there is an invisible shadow on the cave wall who secretly committed this murder? That's nonsense. It is clearly apparent that the other shadow killed him." Well, yes, obviously. The shadows only directly interact with other shadows, but it's because of the puppets that the shadows are doing anything at all, or even exist. This is what is meant when people say matter is animated by spirit. Professor Dawkins attempts to provide another mechanism that could be misfiring to produce religious behaviour. This is the mechanism behind reproductive love. This is misdirected towards a deity and expresses itself in a novel way. Now, there are 3 reasons why this is completely wrong. First of all, by equating love with the reproductive urge, Dawkins is tripping on a limitation of the English language. There are several different kinds of love, most of which are not sexual, which have different names in other languages such as ancient Greek and Latin. For more information on this, you can see my video on Platonic love from my metaphysics series. Dawkins specifically refers to the reproductive or sexual sort as the culprit when the vast majority of religious expressions of love or devotion are devoid of even an analogy to sexual union. Secondly, the professor mentions himself that the parts of the brain involved in religious devotion are not the same as those involved in reproductive love, meaning that there is no reason to think that religious behaviour is not a normative function of those parts, meaning this explanation is an unnecessary imposition done solely for the sake of creating a narrative instead of looking at the evidence and deriving a conclusion from that. Thirdly, there are plenty of examples from the real world of people falling in love with fictional characters and inanimate objects, and their relationships look absolutely nothing like religion, so there is substantial material evidence against this notion. The professor repeatedly referring to love as irrational in this section raises a point for consideration. If, as Dawkins certainly agrees, rationality is just an emergent property of the brain that exists only to aid our survival and reproduction, then it is not any different from love, and there is no objective reason why rationality is better for decision making than love is. In the next video, we will be taking a look at the infamous chapter that popularised a word that has since fluttered away from the professor into common parlance like so many moths. But for now, thanks for watching and have a nice day.